Tyler Bushnell, thank you so much for being on Married to the Games, man. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm psyched to chat with you.
Yeah. So just to jump right in, you come from a huge family of what it seems what a lot would call nerds, starting with your dad and all your siblings. I saw that you're one of 8.
That's correct. Yep.
Goodness gracious. And then your dad, being Nolan Bushnell, was the co-creator of Atari?
Yeah, absolutely. Atari, Chuck E. Cheese, and a few other things in that lane.
That's amazing. So I feel like you had the ace of spades when it came to like kids comparing what their parents did.
Yeah, it was funny though, like, because growing up, I was born in 1980, and Atari was sold in like, I should know this like off the top of my head, but it's like 74, 76 or something.
Gotcha.
So like those times were like a little more like in the past when I was growing up. It was like, oh, like I know my dad did this like really interesting, cool thing with video games, but like that's more like history and not so much like now.
Yeah, you weren't living it as it was happening.
Yeah, correct. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But still to be like, yeah, my dad started that, something that everybody knew.
Totally.
You know what I'm saying? Is pretty nuts. And then Chuck E. Cheese, I'm guessing, is then more in your childhood, is what I'm guessing.
Yeah, a little bit. So Chuck E. Cheese was under my dad's like wing for longer than Atari, because when Time Warner acquired Atari, they were like, "What's this Chuck E. Cheese thing? We don't want that." And he's like, "Okay, I'll keep that." Later on, it went on to be a $1 billion company, and then it's had multiple bankruptcies as well. So. Whatever, but
that's weird how that goes.
Yeah, he also like he actually ended up selling Chuck E. Cheese at like one of the lowest points because he had like sort of put the wrong person in charge of it and like went off like and did other startups, and then like right when those startups were sort of having their own issues, like he looked back at Chuck E. Cheese and it was like imploding, and so like it was kind of the worst possible time.
Right. It's kind of like the life and times of an entrepreneur, right? And so it seems like you grew up under an entrepreneur. Was that something that you always, now as we haven't mentioned it yet, but you as now the president of Polycade, is being an entrepreneur just something you always knew you were going to do since you were little, or is that something that grew as you?
No, I mean, I always like felt like that was my road. From the very beginning. I mean, my dad really like sort of ingrained that in us in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And so, things like, he's like, don't get paid for your time. Basically, it was like a big thing that he liked to say. And like, what's interesting too, is like being on the other side of all of this, I don't think that's a bad thing. like you go to like some other countries where like people are just like super happy and like they're like, the American like live to work versus work to live. Like,
right.
Like
absolutely.
I think there's a lot to be said about work to live. But so for what it's worth, like, that's what we grew up with, was like this entrepreneurial mindset. And so we kind of, in some ways, I had to take that road.
Yeah. And then was it always centered around play? Because just like, reading interviews you've done or seeing stuff you did, it seemed like, especially with there being 8 of you, it seemed like play was a huge part of your rearing, and D&D and imaginative things. Was it always your entrepreneurialism always built around play?
Pretty much, yeah. There was like, my dad did a few things that were not play related. Like ETAC was the first like in-car navigation system that actually went on to be like the basis for Google Maps.
Crazy.
And so it didn't necessarily have to be play related, but that was really where like we love to play. Like we've always been big board gamers. You bring up D&D, like we had this weird little dungeon room in the house growing up, and we'd like at one point, like, you know, went to Home Depot, got a bunch of paint and like other stuff and like converted it into our D&D dungeon. And
oh, that's incredible.
Super fun. Yeah. And
yeah. That's like a dream come true.
Yeah. And there was like a closet with like a trap door. And it like went down into this little room. So it was a sweet.
Oh my God. I feel like every kid wanted a trap door. Like
Totally.
even my daughter, we've been flirting with like looking at houses and moving and stuff. And my daughter's like, I want a bookshelf that opens. And I'm like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Like which one of your friends has a bookshelf that opens into a room?
Right. Totally. You know, funny. We had one of those. But like my dad's like a kid, obviously, but note about that trap door. That thing fell on my head once and I had like 12 stitches.
Oh my gosh. Really?
Yeah, it was heavy.
Jeez Louise. That's crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about Polycade. Where did that get birthed from? Obviously, for those that haven't seen, Polycade is this very cool. It's this. It feels like a love letter to the arcades, is what it feels like when I see it. It's this really great throwback to the arcade life, but at the same time has this really cool aesthetic for now. Can you tell me just how Polycade was birthed?
Yeah, totally. So Polycade kind of came from, you know, I love, as we discussed, I've always loved games. And in my friend group, I'm like the game guy. And so like most of my friends love video games in some capacity, but they're not like buy an Xbox, buy a PlayStation, like kind of folks, right? So when folks would come over to my house, I'd like, you know, sit everybody down on the couch and pass out Xbox controllers, and then we'd play what were essentially like couch co-op games, like Speedrunners, Lethal League, Towerfall, Tricky Tower, these like modern arcade games, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
Which they take like, you know, classic arcade mechanics and just like refresh them, modernize them, mash them together, right? Tricky Towers is like Tetris meets Jenga, right? It's just a super fresh take on the category. And it's a blast. Like you play 2 to 4 players and it's super fun. There's something about like the console experience that like it's a little bit like high barrier to entry in a way, where you have to like have all charged controllers. There's just like, you know, you kind of got to like corral people into like, you know, let's do this thing. Whereas the arcade is like less intentional, right? It's like much more casual. Like a couple people can walk up to it and like start playing, and then the other people like hanging out gravitate towards it. It's just like, more like
it has a draw of its own.
It's like a low barrier to entry. It's more casual. It's like less tedious, right? Like,
yeah. Do you think it's because it's so directed, right? Like when you see an arcade cabinet, that's what that's for. When you see a television in the middle of a living room, that's used for a bunch of things, whether you're watching, you know, television, movies, you know, you're playing things like Drawful and you know, from the Jackbox games, and it can be your, you know, Xbox and all that stuff.
Yeah, you're right. Like the arcade is the fact that everything's ready to go and all dedicated, right? That screen belongs to this system. Like it matters a lot, right? Like, it just makes it so much more convenient, you know, like if you also think about like when I'm having a coffee in the morning, like I can just like jump on the machine and play a couple games. Whereas like I would never sit down on the couch, boot up a console and like,
interesting,
you know, it's just like too much for some reason. It just feels too much. And then there's also like the social aspect of the arcade, right? Where like, I like to say like, you know, at a party, you would never like sit down on the couch and play a console.
That's right.
But you would play an arcade machine and that would be cool.
You'd go back and forth on Galaga. Even, you know what I mean?
Totally.
You know, even something that was one player at a time, I feel like people still would corral around an arcade machine to take turns and watch other people play.
Totally. Yeah. It's like the original esports, right? Like you want to watch like look over the shoulder and like see how someone's doing and like, you know, cheer and talk smack when they die.
Yeah, absolutely. So Polycade's really birthed from that love of getting together with your friends and wanting to have more of a walk-up experience than like, oh, let me make sure I've got this update and blah 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 blah. Just
totally, yeah. So it was birthed from like that seeing that interaction with the friends was one part of it, probably a really important part. The second part was like, I grew up with arcade games, obviously, and some of those games just are not. You can't really play them on anything else, or at least it sort of kills the experience, right?
Absolutely. There's nothing like a joystick and buttons.
Totally, yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, if I sit down and play, because I think it's available on Steam and some other places, but if I sit down and play Miss Pac-Man, it just doesn't feel as good on the controller as it does with a joystick.
No.
There's just no other way to play it, right?
Totally. Yeah, it just doesn't. It's not the same experience. Like, you can kind of get the experience, but like, is that the experience you want?
Right. So you guys have like the huge Squadcade over at Polycade.com. You've got this really cool. To me, it reminds me of the old school Nintendo cabinets. The Nintendo cabinets that would have the screen and then the screen on top.
It is the old school Nintendo cabinet.
The Polycade Retro. And so now you guys are launching the Polycade Sente, which to my memory, because I've been watching Polycade for a little bit, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit of a fan, but looks like a kind of a reimagined Lux. Is that correct? Can you kind of talk us through that?
Totally, yeah. So the Sente is basically replacing the Lux. The Lux is now discontinued and sold out, except we have one machine left.
Ooh.
And it's actually a really weird one. We had like a whatever. I'll get into it. It's a bathing ape Polycade.
Oh, sick!
Yeah, it's like pink camo.
Yeah, I love
it's
that.
Like officially
nice.
Unofficial. I could tell you more about that.
Matches the shoes.
Yeah, the hoodie. Yeah,
yeah.
But so the Sente is the reimagined Lux. Basically, we took like the Lux. We made some very early design decisions with the Lux that like. Before I'm originally a software engineer, like getting into hardware and everything was a new experience for me 8 years ago. And so like, there was a lot of decisions made early on that like later we've sort of found like minor issues with. And so, and even things like the size of the unit, like tips us into like the next freight category, which is basically costing everyone like an extra $150 in shipping, right?
Interesting.
So like the Sente takes like all of these little things and optimizes them, like all of these little things with the Lux and optimizes them. It also like puts forth features that we designed for the Lux, but never like released because like the swappable control panel situation.
That is so freaking cool, by the way. And as we're talking about this, people might not know what these things look like, but the Lux is this really great looking half cabinet is kind of what I call it, that goes on the wall instead of standing up and taking up all this space in your house. Cause that was one of the struggles I had. I remember when I turned 30 forever ago. I remember waking up one morning and I was like, wait a second. I've always wanted an arcade in my house and I'm a grown man now and can do that. But the big fight was, where do I put it, right? With the wife. And so we go back and forth. Obviously she still let me get it. And, we had it for years and years and we really loved it. But that was always the issue. And it seems like the Polycade Lux, the first version of what we're talking about, really handles that problem. It looks good. And then, when my wife first saw the Sente, she goes, oh, that's so cool looking. And I was like, uh-oh, I feel a little window, baby. And so
Nice.
I was like, yeah, all you got to do is crack the door. I'm kicking that thing open. And so, right away I set an alarm for, and, bought into the VIP and everything like that for the Sente launch. But, so this thing goes on the wall and, it's got the two controllers the Lux did, with the rollerball in the middle. But then you do introduce this really interesting thing in the Sente with the swappable controls. Because that was one of my problems when I first bought, I think it was like an H5 cabinet. It came with like the the joystick and 2 buttons.
Right.
And I wanted a joystick and 6 buttons, right?
Yeah.
Because I wanted a Street Fighter and do all the things with my kids and stuff like that. And that was really hard to track down at the time, just because it's an old cabinet, you know, who's got just that extra part lying around. It's not like it's being made. And so, man, talk about this swappable, I mean, from the joystick to the steering wheel to the light gun. Yeah. Tell us about that.
Yeah, totally. Well, so when I started like sitting down and, you know, thinking like, okay, I'm going to make this arcade machine, like, so coming back to actually part of the origin story that you touched on, you know, when I was building the first one, I told my wife, like, I want to put this in the living room because that's where people hang out. That's where they congregate. That's right. Where it makes sense. And she was like, absolutely not. She's like an interior designer, furniture designer. So like, she's like, no way there's going to be an arcade machine in the living room.
That's right. It's too big.
And I was like, and it looks a certain way, right? It looks like this thing that we all think goes in the garage or the basement.
That's right.
And so like, I was like, well, wait a minute, like we can solve this. Like, what if it looked different? And so like, I came up with 20 designs and she like pointed at one and she's like, that can go in the living room.
No way.
And so that was a key factor right there.
I mean, what a great way to do that. Like, solving your own problems. Like, I'm going to draw 20 of these. You just pick which one can go in the living room.
Exactly. Yeah. Teamwork here.
Yeah. And so that ended up being the Lux.
That ended up being the Lux. Yeah. So then coming back to it, because I mentioned that because the design was important, right? And and still like wanted to be able to access all these different kinds of arcade games. And there's a lot of people don't know that like there's actually multiple joysticks. So like there's most
8-way, 4-way.
Yeah, most games are played with 8-way joysticks, but like a lot of the really cool retro games like Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, like tons of them
are just up, down, left, right instead of the diagonals.
Yeah, and if you have a diagonal in there, the game freaks out and picks randomly, right? So it's like it ruins the experience if you're playing a 4-way game with an 8-way stick. We've kind of like found a way around that.
Sure.
It's because you can. There's like a little hack. It's not perfect, but it's good enough. So like our 8-way sticks work okay for those 4-way games. But a 4-way stick is still better. Right. So coming back to it, there's lots of different kinds of arcade controls for you know, different arcade games, including different sticks. And so you'll when you're like looking around at like building your own arcade machine, you see like people who have solved this by putting every control on their arcade machine. And I call this the Franken panel.
That's right.
Because it's like giant, right? And like sometimes there's even like 2 like layers, like
levels. Levels.
There's 2 levels because like you gotta like reach in to get to the next layer to like put enough stuff like in front of the screen. And so like that was obviously out of the question. And so the only real solution after that point is like a swappable panel system. So like that was.
Can you break down some of that? Because in the videos, you know, you guys showing off, it just looks like it slides out, slides it. You know what I'm saying? Is it really that simple, or what's the kind of the tech behind it?
Yeah. So like the you know, we actually 5 years ago we actually designed a contact connector that like when you slip these in, it would just like connect.
Wow.
And that kind of worked. It was like the tolerances were really tight. So like, it was a pain in the factory assembly. Like it didn't like USB is weird and connectors are weird. They don't like vibrations. And so we
when you're banging on
exactly
buttons, that's a problem.
So like we ended up
when you're playing track and field, you
totally.
gotta have something a little bit more sturdy.
right. So like we ended up like shelving that and like not going forward with that. Like just doing a regular plug-in USB just makes more sense. It's easy enough. Like so that's how that works. But pretty much those just slide in and like you have to like unplug and plug in USB on the back, but that's it.
It's so
easy.
wild looking, and it looks like such a such a fix. If you're wanting to play, Golden Tee and and stuff like that, when you're like, shoot, I really wanted a trackpad for this.
Yeah.
Or going from the 2 buttons to the six buttons, or using a joystick and stuff like that, and using the light guns.
Totally.
Can you talk a little bit about you guys also have a store that's kind of where you can download games and stuff like that, as well as side loading ROMs and things like that?
Totally. Yeah. So kind of like our thesis as a company is twofold. We want this to be like, arcade machines appeal to kind of a broad range of users, some of whom are like not gamers, right? And so a core goal for us is to make these machines like easy to use, and so that anyone can just like get going. It's like, very easy, user friendly, plug and play, right? So that's like step one. Step two is that like, we're gamers and tech guys, and like, we don't want a machine that is like locked down or like walled garden or any of that. So like,
absolutely,
the goal is to make it highly extensible. And I also believe that like, if the market is a certain way, and like you kind of need to embrace all of the things that are out there, just to be the best product, right?
Absolutely.
And so we hooked it up so that like, my favorite is, I love dipping into the retro stuff for sure. I love having access to that stuff. But my personal favorite are all the modern titles, the modern arcade titles. And so like, the access to Steam, we have it so that you can, any Steam games you install on your Polycade just like automatically show up in the UI, and you can launch them from there.
Sick.
And then, you can sideload ROMs. That's super easy to do. We've also kind of like demystified that a little bit, where like, our software automatically installs in emulators and configures them for our controls, because we've standardized our controls.
Right.
It just like works across the board with pretty much every ROM that you drop in there. So like, you don't have to like do the configuration, the MAME setup,
right?
Which
all
is
that
like,
tricky stuff on the side.
Totally. Like, even if you're a tech guy, that stuff's a pain.
Right. You're like, why is this not working? Oh no, why is it in Japanese?
And like, I have to crawl through the internet and like forum posts from like 5 years ago? Like, let me just not do that.
Absolutely. Man, before I let you go, man, I'd love to talk about just number one, the Kickstarter. I mean, I know that maybe because of your upbringing and who your dad is, and obviously too what your siblings are into. They're into super freaking cool stuff when it comes to the entertainment space as well. But man, oh man, I was shocked to watch the numbers just jump on the Kickstarter, especially that day one. I don't remember exactly what the number was, but I feel like before I went to bed, it was at like $900,000 that first day. Was that a surprise to you? Was that what you thought would happen?
We did our quite a bit of like pre-marketing and like list building and stuff. And there's a few ways to do that where you can kind of like get a feel for where it's going to land. So like, we hit like right about where we thought it would land, where we thought and hoped it would land. And that was based off of just like, ways to like, we did a reservation system so that people could like lock in the lowest price. And then we're also doing like several limited edition artist games, which are going to be really sick. And like, it's hard to explain that because it's a little complicated, but like, we've mentioned it. And once people see these games, they're going to be pumped.
That's so dope.
So the reservations like got people extra perks, and like you put down $1 to reserve it. And so that's like nothing. And then, that gives us an indication, like someone who's going to like put up their credit card before the campaign launches has a very high intent to purchase. So
yes, I was.
Yeah.
Nailed it.
So like, we could like sort of cross-reference our like reservations against like when we send an email out about it to the reservation list, like what's the open rate? And so like, we kind of estimated that we would land at that number.
That's awesome. So the Kickstarter is at like $1.3 million now, which is just incredible. 23 days to go as we're recording this. So plenty of time for people to jump in there. I highly recommend people to go do this only for a few reasons. Number one, it's just freaking cool looking. Number two, you come from a family of royalty, and I just think that provides a look at this thing that a lot of people don't have as just somebody who's just starting up and doing something. Number three, as somebody who built an arcade machine from the ground up, it's a lot of work. And it's a lot of soldering, and it's a lot of troubleshooting and getting the screen to look just right. And, dealing with those old school heavy monitors, it's just so nuts. So this thing looks so much more plug and play. Also, you guys have the ability to put your new games in there, your new consoles, the PS5s and the Switches and stuff like that. And so it's just like, it's kind of an all-in-one little cabinet that you can have for this thing, which I think is just
totally
such a great idea.
Yeah. And don't wait, because right now we've got still like a couple deals on the site. So like if you wait longer, it goes up a little more, the price point. And then one other thing that's worth mentioning is like, because this is a pre-sale, they're offered at like anywhere from 33 to 38% off right now. Once they ship in March, it will be $2,500 as the MSRP. That's the final retail price. So now is like a great time to get in, and like we're going to be offering extra perks along the way. All of the things are discounted across the board, the different like controller attachments and whatnot. So it's great for us as a company to have like this like pre-sale factor, because manufacturing is hard to like judge quantities and all of that. So getting these like advance orders is worth it for us to give you a big discount. It helps us. Also, having the public number out there of like what this campaign does is really helpful for us to move forward and like license additional games. And like the more that we can like push this campaign, the more we can do with the product.
Yeah, absolutely. That's why, and I was going to ask, you kind of answered it, and that was why Kickstarter in the first place. But I mean, that makes total sense to be able to see, the attach rate that people have to it, and know that like, hey, we actually have dollars behind this. This is not just something that we're coming up with that we hope works.
Yeah.
But it's kind of working before it's even out. Have you done Kickstarter on all your releases?
No, we did our very first like product launch when we started 8 years ago was on Kickstarter. And then this is our first time back. We did an Indiegogo campaign in between that, like we made a lot of mistakes in that campaign. So like, no, I don't think it was Indiegogo or whatever, or,
sure.
But like, I sort of look at that campaign kind of as like a little bit of a failure. Live and learn.
There you go. Exactly right. So kind of like vinyl's had this crazy comeback over the last couple of years. I know board games have had the same resurgence.
Totally.
I know you're a big board game guy, so I had to ask you before we let you go too. What's some of your favorite board games to sit down and play around the table type thing?
Oh, dude. I mean, I can't wait till I can play board games again, but like my like 2.5-year-old and 6 month.
Oh yeah, that's not happening, baby.
It's been like no board games for Tyler time the last 2 years, but a few favorites since in recent days. Really love Glory. There's a game called Glory that's like mini D&D. It's like a super easy to understand game that kind of scratches the D&D itch. Like, I can play it with like my 5-year-old nephew. And that's a fantastic game. It's like really good appeal for lots of people, while also being like just on that like edge of like complexity and adventure for the rest of us.
Yeah, still has the depth.
Yeah, and it's a great replayability too. So that's one of my favorites recently. And then also New York Zoo is a great, what's the dude? Uwe? Agricola guy.
New York Zoo.
Uwe Rosenberg. It's a famous board game creator. But New York Zoo is one of his recent ones that's like really good. It's a relatively short play for a new game. And also just like a easy to understand one that you can kind of like, jump into. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Sick. So Polycade, the new Sente, please check it out. I know that you guys got to be forward thinking, even though this is a love letter to retro. In your mind, what do you think is next in the entertainment realm? We've had such great leaps and bounds with, I feel like, just with VR, with AR, we've seen, Pokemon Go took over the world a couple of years ago, just geo stuff. And then you've got escape rooms and stuff like that. Do you have any finger on the pulse of what you think is coming next that's going to pop off for us?
It's an interesting point. Like, we are like, so like always thinking about like what's next for Polycade.
Right. Yeah. I got to. Yeah.
What we can do with this. I'm curious where like Netflix gaming is going to go and whatnot. I think that stuff would be interesting. Right. But yeah, I mean, I think that the gaming continues to like penetrate all aspects of like, it's just, when you look at the charts and stuff, gaming just keeps going up.
That's right. That's right.
Arcade has been interesting to us because we feel like it reaches a broader audience, including gamers. And it's also the only gaming format that works for commercial spaces.
Interesting.
Bars and restaurants and everywhere else. So like, we're really excited about the next thread of like Polycade esports ultimately.
Sick. We need some Polycades. Like, we need Polycades in the mall all over the place. It just has you guys' stuff in there,
Exactly. And like your community centers and your bars and leagues is something that we're really interested in. When you look at like bowling and darts, like those are still around because of leagues, and that's what makes them successful. And so we feel like arcade gaming leagues, for whether it's like everything from casual to pro, like is going to be a super fun thread. We want to see people like forming their like, the Warriors movie. Imagine like league teams that like have their like red leather jackets or something.
Their jackets. We got the Jets and the Sharks going on from West Side Story.
Exactly. Like
that's amazing.
Putting their karate belts around their foreheads.
But jerseys and all, just the whole thing that can explode from that. Absolutely.
And like the like social connectivity of video games is really interesting.
And we've lost so much of it. Even couch co-op is tough. I think people don't even remember that you can still play Call of Duty couch co-op.
Totally.
You know what I'm saying? And you don't think you got to be at home or on a different system. And it's definitely a dying thing that, as a kid of the 80s and 90s, it pains me, to kind of see arcades getting shut down left and right. I've loved the resurgence of barcades. I think that's an incredible idea. And so I just feel like this gives all those tastes in one with the Polycade Sente, man. And I think you guys have done an incredible thing so far.
Awesome. Thanks. Well, yeah, we're psyched for the future of it as well. I think this feels like we're right at the beginning of everything we've wanted to do, even though we've been doing, I mean, man, arcade machines, it's a hardware component. It's a software component. It's a licensing component. Like, it's not a small mountain to climb, and we've come a long way already. So it feels like we're just like at the point where we can really push it on all fronts. We've got the hardware completely solved. The software's in a great spot, and like the next features that we get to release on the software side are just going to be like the stuff that's extra super fun. And then, licensing is, you reminded me about Golden Tea. So, that's the email I'm
get on it
next.
And you do have some big names backing it, you know what I'm saying? Which has been really fun. It's got to be super fun for you guys, right? To be rubbing shoulders with some of those, you know, some of those folks, some of those celebrities, Lil Jon and them.
Yeah, totally. John's the nicest dude you've ever met.
That's what I've heard. That's amazing.
Yeah.
I love it.
Absolutely.
Dude, Tyler, thank you for taking the time. Thanks for talking to us here at MTTG, man. We appreciate it, and good luck with everything.
Awesome. Thanks, Gabe. Much appreciated for having me.